Hello, everybody in social media land. My name is Danielle Dionne, and I'm an organizer with No Violence for Kids Canada. And we are here to call public awareness to repeal Section 43 of the Criminal Code of Canada, which is Call to Action 6 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. It is up to us as Canadians to take responsibility in reconciliation, and we do our part at No Violence for Kids Canada to make sure that children are protected from violence in their homes, in their communities, and in their schools. And in doing so, we opened a Facebook group and we've been gathering voices together, and almost over 1,000 people so far have joined us. And what we're doing is just sharing any information that's possible and collaborating with organizations around the globe and within Canada and within each province, and with all of the nations and Indigenous groups across our great territories. I am here in Surrey, British Columbia, which is the unceded land of the Tawasin Nation, home of the Semiahmoo people, amongst a cathedral of cement. And I'm very certain this is not how this land was meant to be used. I'm grateful to be here. And in my work, everything that I do is to reduce violence in the lives of children. I do that in my job, in my practice, and here in my volunteer work. And just to start us off, I would like to start with a quote. Everyone who helps a child in their lives is a hero of mine. And today I am sitting here with one of the greatest heroes I've ever had a chance to talk to. I get a little fangirly over activists. So those who know me might think already know this, but I'm here with Jillian van Turnhout. And for those of you that need to know more, I'm going to talk about her bio. So here we go. First off, Jillian is a former Irish parliamentarian, a senator, and she spearheaded a range of policy decisions and legislative changes. But most notably, and why we're here, is Jillian took the step forward and stood up and was a leader in banning corporal punishment in Ireland. And this is a big conversation for us here in Canada because we've yet to go there. And today we get to sit with somebody who's walked that path, who went through it, and who knows what happens after. Jillian also is a former CEO of the Children's Rights Alliance and former chair of the Children's Hospital of Ireland, 12-year member of the European Union Advisory Board, now a chartered director and consultant in governance, in executive selection, and advocacy. And so without any more time of me talking, let's get started. Let's talk to Jillian van Turnhout. I encourage everybody out there to add a comment. I'm watching the comments and I'll add them live to our broadcast. Please like, share everything we do at No Violence for Kids Canada. Anyways, here's Jillian. Hello, Jillian. Welcome.
Hi, how are you? It's very difficult to follow that introduction there. You know, I'm not used to being called a hero, but I'm learning as women that we need to take these compliments and just enjoy them.
I am so happy to call you a hero. Absolutely. Jillian, let's just start. Just tell me a little bit. I know we talked before the broadcast about your incredible career and what got you there, but I think it's important to note. Talk to me more and tell us all about what led you to Parliament. How did you start this passion? Yeah.
Yeah, it's what led me to Parliament. I started my professional career actually in the private sector, selling office supplies. So like so many people, loving office supplies, etc. And was always a volunteer in youth work. So very much involved with the Girl Guides, but other children's and youth organizations. So always had this natural inclination. In fact, one of my career choices early on, I was thinking of getting involved in was childcare, but my mother advised me not to because I'd give too much to it and I'd never have any free time for myself. So that's where I ended up in the private sector. And I don't know, somehow I was always drawn to the work on children and young people. And then different things happened in my life and I said, I'm going to take a career path change. And I saw the job with the Children's Rights Alliance and I went for interview. And much to my own surprise, I was what they wanted at that time. They had some private philanthropic funding. So they were actually looking for somebody with a business background, but also understanding of the issues. So unbeknownst to me, I had taken the right pathway to get that job. So I became chief executive of the Children's Rights Alliance, and it was a big learning curve for me. And I luckily had an amazing staff team who informed and educated me. And I'm sure still look at some of the things I say and say, yeah, we got Jillian right on that. You know, helped and encouraged me. And I was about 6 or 7 years in that job, and doing my work with the European Union, when I got a phone call from our Prime Minister, or Taoiseach, to ask me to become a senator. So it was really quite bizarre, quite strange. I was actually in China at the time, get this phone call in the back of a taxi, you know, like, oh, would you like to be? And I had already thought, I should say, I had lobbied or then Prime Minister, when he was in opposition as one of the opposition leaders, I lobbied him a lot on children's issues. And when he'd set up his government, he had already given us a Minister for Children for the first time in Ireland. We had a Minister for Children, and he'd made a commitment to hold a referendum to strengthen children's rights in our constitution. So I felt I had already won. I felt, you know, I've already won. And so to get the phone call was just like, what, you want me also to do even more. But he wanted to ensure, because, and I'm sure we'll touch on it, like Canada, our past is not a good story of how we have treated certain groups of children and young people, or certain families and certain categories. So he wanted to ensure that there was going to be an independent and strong voice for children, that they won't be forgotten in the Parliament, and that I would continue to speak the truth. So it was an immense privilege. So I was appointed at that moment, like when the phone call ended, I was now a senator. It was very, very surreal. But I now had to do good, because I now needed to bring all that I had from the outside been knocking on the doors of many parliamentarians, asking them to do. I now had an opportunity to make my own mark. But, you know, and I'm sure same in Canada, you're only one of many. So you're trying to make sure that you make the mark in the right places. But one of the pieces of advice that my Prime Minister gave me was to stick to what you know, and just get, you know, really work on that area. And I was very clear that I'd been appointed because of my work on children's rights. So I became adept over my 5-year term of, I can now look at any piece of legislation and tell you where there's a children's rights aspect to it, and how we can amend that piece of law to strengthen children's rights. And I hadn't realized it so much, but it's amazing when you put that lens on, you realize the world has been designed by a certain cohort for their own ends and purposes. And
that's probably a great other though.
Yeah, we need to re-engineer things and rethink of how we do things and why we do things. And I think even the past few years should remind us of how things we've always done, all of a sudden we're able to change overnight. So we need to stop accepting the status quo and say, is that really the best way for us to do it? Is that? And one of the pieces that I knew I did want to change, and it's on the record very early on in my term, I'd raised about the issue of corporal punishment. But it was a very sensitive, difficult issue, as it is in Canada. And I certainly didn't know if I was going to succeed in my wish, but I was going to at least put it on the record.
Wow. Well, and there's so much that you said there that I have many questions about. First off, the person who called you up and said, "Do you want to be a senator?" is also a hero. So shout out to that person who took the courage and heard a true voice and put you in the right room. I think that's a big piece there. And then also just hearing what you say, our global situation right now, and how decisions are being made and how globalization is coming together is really putting a crunch on issues. And stress on people, and also an awakening of information. So I'm hearing you kind of open up to that. So decisions now need to be made now, right? I see in my career and working with families that the stress on parents is overwhelming, and it does fall on the shoulders of children. Children are at more risk now, more than ever. And I know that those of us on the front lines who get reports and who are working with parents have never experienced this kind of stress. It's an underlying kind of bubbling, nervous energy that's happening in family life right now after the pandemic or within the pandemic, wherever we are on the 8th wave, 6th wave. But the pandemic will always be with us. So there'll always be, this overarching fear of disease now. Massive information that's out there on parents, and so they create some competition. Also, how do you parent? Systems that are being decolonized or not, that add stress and more stress. Programming that is siloed, that is difficult to access without gatekeeping. Parents that are also like a melting pot, which is wonderful, but a lot of diverse parenting styles that we didn't see maybe 40 years ago, brings up more kind of tension between parents. Children have a whole new world to explore online. So we have that. I mean, I really do dig deep into the levels of stress that cause parents to feel too busy, fatigued, and overwhelmed. This is at a critical juncture. Kids are being hit, and we need to stop this. They need legal protection from violence, as well as their right to self-determination and participation in, their decision making. They, like you wrote, Jillian, they are independent rights holders. And in order for Canada to move forward, what is your advice, and how did that decision be made? That's kind of what I'm interested in, because you got in there and then you unraveled it. So you lobbied. Who did you talk to? Tell us more details.
I suppose when I first started on the issue of corporal punishment, for me, I took it so clearly as an absolute, why would you hit a child? And, I didn't understand. But I also saw that when I raised the issue, people felt I was judging either how they were raised or how they raised their children. So they felt there's this judgment piece. And, obviously I'm very tied into the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and different pieces of legislation, but that wasn't the way to persuade parents or to persuade the public to come with us. When you start digging into the research, and obviously, we do have to mention Liz Gershoff's amazing piece of research, but if you read all of the research, and I have read so much different pieces of research on this, actually as a legislator, I now have incontrovertible proof that hitting a child does not work. So it doesn't have a positive effect. It won't make a positive behavior for the child. And the likelihood is it could have a negative effect for your child. So as a legislator, surely I have a role to tell parents this does not work. Because in fact, actually legislators at the moment, because you're right, parents have the toughest job in the world. They have the best job in the world, but they have the toughest job in the world. I've always said this. So for me, it's how do we ensure that our laws support parents and actually supports. And all too often in these debates, it's that we put children at one side of the room and parents at the other side of the room, as if they're up against one another. And in fact, if we want to talk about pester power, for me, it's parents who use their pester power for the education of their child, for the healthcare of their child. It's parents who are doing that. So actually, by giving children additional rights, we're helping parents in that role. So this for me is where they're interconnected, because parents want to do their very best for their child. So we have the research that we know.
Absolutely.
And then when you start looking at this law, that we have a law that says, and the origins of the law in Canada, in Ireland, in all these colonial past countries, they all have the same origins from UK common law, English common laws. So they all have that same origin. But when you start unpicking it, we actually have a law that says you can hit someone as long as they're smaller than you.
Right.
Because that's the effect of the law. So
without being angry.
Without being angry. Well, in Canada, without being angry, So, it's so if I'm in a debate with you, Danielle, and I'm not happy with the way it's going, or I feel you're being unreasonable, I can't just give you a hit. And rightly so, understandably so, because that would be wrong. and yet are smaller than you, and you have these property rights over a child. And that's why I say children are independent rights holders.
That's right.
The law doesn't give them equal protection. And when we were bringing the law change into Ireland, people said, "Oh, but you're going to see an increase in prosecutions. You're going to see more children taken into care, targeting of certain families." And I understand, because, and I particularly, like Canada, in Ireland, there are certain families, certain communities that were targeted more than others by our social care. So that's an absolute. But let me be absolutely clear. We have not seen an increase in prosecutions or an increase in children being taken into care. So there's no foundation, because when we were debating it in Ireland, I would say to people, if I'm in a supermarket and I see a child, on the verge of having a little upset moment or a tantrum, it's usually because the sweets are misplaced, or they're at a low level, like they're not at the level of the parents' eyes, they're at the level of the child's, they're there to attract, it's very deliberate marketing. And so if a child is going to have, I don't immediately jump in and say, "Oh, where's the phone number for the police? I need to ring somebody for care, to get this child into care." No, I don't. I look to see, how do we de-escalate this situation? How do we support it? So usually Jillian's thing is that I'll normally loudly complain about the placing of sweets in supermarkets, or in placing going, like, you can't blame the child, like they're being put, so the parent knows, I understand what's happening. I'm not putting a pressure on you. This is not a judgment on you. My judgment is on the supermarket here. So I think when we're looking at these situations, in the same way that if I saw a fight between two adults, I would be looking to see, how do we de-escalate it? How do we calm things down? Obviously, you're going to make sure it's safe. You're going to make sure. So when we're bringing it in Ireland, we framed it about equal protection. We want children to have the same protection adults have. And at the moment, our law had it, and we've changed it in Ireland. But in Canada, your law is actually saying the home is one of the unsafest places for a child, because that is the place where they're allowed to be hit. And it's just, when you start thinking it's just so absurd. It makes no sense. But yet we have laws, and right across the world there are laws, and we've just accepted it as the status quo. So when I came in Ireland to change the law, and obviously there was a sequencing of events that we were very lucky with, that the government lost their majority in the upper house on a very different issue, but they needed my vote on different issues. So I was able to use that leverage. I had built up quite good respect of my colleagues on children's rights, that I wasn't a crusader or a do-gooder, but although, like, then I've embraced the term do-gooder, because I started going, well, what's wrong with a do-gooder? Like, I started at first
making do-gooder.
But anyway, but I suppose I was in that perfect position, but I also didn't know how my colleagues felt when I came to change the law in Ireland. So I do know that I remember thinking, and I'm a big researcher, so I went back looking over past transcripts. And in the 60s, one of my former colleagues, he tried to change the law to ban the slapping of girls in schools. So it was just girls in schools. And he only managed to get a handful of senators to support him. And I thought, oh my God, that could be me. That could be, like, Jillian goes in on her crusade to change the law, and only a few colleagues vote with me. And then I thought about it, going, well, I know all the research. I know I'm right. I know that this is the right thing to do. And actually, if a child is being hit in Ireland, would it not be better that they at least have some adults standing up there in the Parliament saying it is wrong?
Yes.
So actually, the worst thing that can happen to me is I could lose the vote, but actually a child at least is hearing that this is wrong. So that's my worst is, it's for me, but actually a child being hit, it is far worse, and far worse. And I did, because I did use a strategy, I did use a ploy. I tabled lots of amendments to our Minister for Children and Youth Affairs legislation. Like, I did it on every issue you can think about. The age you can marry. So because up to recently in Ireland, you could marry before the age of 18 with court dispensation. But we've since managed to change that. All these different issues in relation to children. I sort of I spent a summer making amendments, and I put down all these amendments to this piece of legislation, which would frustrate the minister's bill, because he then has to deal with because I've become so adept at changing legislation. And his officials actually met me the day before to go through each of my amendments. And I went through each of them. And I went through why I felt so strongly and all my research, etc. And then we got to my last one, which was on corporal punishment.
Right.
And I said then at the end of the meeting, I'd drop all of those other amendments if you gave me this one. You just give me one and I can let the others go.
Wow.
This is the one. Because I knew that the one on corporal punishment was the only one. I was in a privileged position. I wasn't elected.
Right.
I wasn't going before an electorate.
Right.
So I knew that, okay, I'm in the right place at the right time. It has to be me who has to take this forward. And I don't mean this as me being, it's just, I'm very logical, very strategic. It makes sense. This makes sense. I have a majority. This is not a law. People were pulling me by the side saying, Jillian, time's not right. Wait a few weeks, wait a few months, wait a few years. They gave me every reason from it's the wrong piece of legislation you're using. It's, we need more parenting supports. We need to, do better in social services.
Yes.
You've heard all of this in Canada too. You've heard all of these excuses. So they gave me all of those reasons why. And I said, look, I will drop all of my other amendments, but give me this one. And they, very serious and everything, nothing. So they left my office shortly after 10 o'clock that morning. And at 4 o'clock that afternoon, I got a phone call to see would I have time to meet the minister and his secretary general. So I said, yeah, of course, being very casual, going, oh my God, something's happening here. So I ran over to the other buildings to meet the minister. And the minister joked me. He said, you ruined my whole day. It had to get after your meeting this morning. We've had meetings all day long about how we're going to deal with this, how we're going to deal with all of your amendments. He says, I've been on to the Attorney General. So I really, it was like, oh, okay.
So stuff there, Jillian.
Yeah, so he knew I was serious about it. He knew I wasn't doing it for grandstanding. I was doing this for a real reason. He understood. So he actually said to me, he said, look, I can't promise it tomorrow, but what I can do is I can give you a commitment that I'm going to do my very best over the coming weeks. So when the legislation gets to the next stage, but he said, you need to buy me time. And I said, that's fine, Minister. I said, but then I'm leaving all my amendments on the table. So I don't take anything off the table till I know. But I said, I've given my word. I'll let everything else drop.
Wow.
If I can get this one. And he put, in fairness, even the next day, because he knew I was being fair about it, he put it quite strongly. He said, I will do all in my power to bring this legislation through. So I knew then that but I also knew what we wanted to happen. We didn't want to happen was a big public debate on the issue, because it's one of these types of issues that I believe you actually need the law to change first, and then the behavioural change will follow very quickly. Okay. It's not, look, and I'm sure you have in Canada too, you have this sensationalizing of issues. Mm-hmm. And in fact, if you think of the smoking in public places, if you think of wearing seatbelts in cars, actually the legislation changes. Yes. I grew up, when I was a child, we didn't have seatbelts in cars. They only came in during my childhood. Like, it's bizarre now if I look at a picture of a car without seatbelts. Like, I'm going, how could you imagine? Yeah. But if you think about the seatbelts in cars, it now even gives permission to a driver to say, no, put your seatbelt on. Right. Nobody would think, oh, you're in some way. But I just knew. And for me, I suppose everybody had warned me, don't cross the threshold of the family home. But changing the legislation, it wasn't a big shake in Ireland. It wasn't a big shock. And I now talk to people, and people will look at me going, oh, no, the law has changed in this area, not realizing that it was me who changed the law. And I go, oh, really? Has it? Tell me more.
Tell me more.
It has seeped into the public knowledge. Like, so that's what fascinates me, is now that it's just accepted. oh no, in Ireland you're not allowed to hit. And I go, okay, tell me more.
Can you, this is incredible to think about. I was just actually speaking to a professor who, Tracy Carrier-Smith, by the way, just to drop a name, who talked to me about, I'm looking at transdisciplinary research in social sciences, and of course, around violence in children is kind of my focus in parenting. And she, she posed a question to me: do you need to do a whole transdisciplinary community-based values study that can take 2 years for something that that it's the right thing to do, So is all of this research and all this money that we put into all this engagement, is all of this really, when we're talking about a social justice issue that is about clearly, it's the right thing to do? And it shocked me because I've been studying research design and like all of these things. And it really, so I want to ask you a bit more about this. What I'm sensing from you is just this incredible political will. Was there already public pressure? So tell me, political will is such an incredible, it's almost like a political spirit, something that comes in alive, and somebody who has an opportunity like you do. It's not about, connecting to community researchers. It's not about doing all of the work that we study. So what is that? How did that happen?
I suppose for me it was partly how I framed it. So I certainly wanted to make sure when we brought in the change in law, there was no sanctions added to it. So there was nothing that we already have laws to protect children. We have laws about violence against children,
right?
But we had this threshold of when they could intervene. So for me, it was removing that defense about reasonable chastisement. It wasn't about adding any. So for me, it was to make sure that this wasn't about adding any new laws or any new penalties on parents, because that would have been twisted.
Right.
What was interesting in the Seanad, because like I did raise with my mother in the gallery that, when I grew up, she would say, you're not too old for the wooden spoon. And we all, in Ireland, the wooden spoon was the threat, and she'd run around the house. Now, I never got hit. Yeah. But it was always used as a threat that you could be hit. And partly I shared that because I wanted to give permission to my colleagues that this wasn't about how I was raised or how any of us were raised. That we now have new research. So all of that research that's now available, we now need to, and I don't think doing further research will get any more conclusive, because
it's exhausting.
Mountains. Yeah.
Mountains.
Yeah. So all of that, absolute research there. And I've looked at people who may have a contrary position, but their research isn't scientifically based. It isn't evidenced appropriately. Yeah. So it's not, and it's a sliver compared to that tome of research that is overwhelmingly showing us that hitting of children doesn't work. So I suppose when my colleagues were speaking, what I found fascinating, and maybe it's the age cohort, and maybe it's similar in Canada, they didn't speak about how they raised their children, but they did speak about that nobody should ever hit their grandchildren, and they were doing this for their grandchildren.
So that's important. Yeah.
Yeah. So we had this generational shift, so that they felt they could, and I kind of felt it was their way of saying, I'm not going to discuss how I raised my children. I'm not going to discuss how I was raised. But actually, if anybody hits my grandchild, because I now have this research.
So I do think of mine. Going for the grandparents in Canada. Here I come.
Because I do think we need to give people permission, because this isn't like my parents didn't know any different.
Right.
The legislator in Scotland, he would say that he used corporal punishment, because Scotland has since made the change and Wales have made the change, and I've been there. So this isn't about how any of us were raised, but this is about the next generation of children. We now have all of this research. We know it doesn't work. It doesn't improve outcomes, and it has the potential to have psychological and physical harm. So and I suppose for me was conscious of, when something doesn't work, what do? I either stop doing it or I try harder. Okay. And when we're trying harder, we're really putting children at risk. So we really have to take it out of our toolkit
Yeah.
that in our head, that it's not one of the pieces of the toolkit I go for. In the same way, as I said to you earlier, I can't hit you if I don't feel our conversation is going right. It's not in my toolkit.
No.
So why do we have it in the parents' toolkit? And we
Yeah.
have a responsibility as legislators that it doesn't even appear in the heads.
And it makes sense, right, Jillian? I mean, we come with what we know, a history and tradition of punishment from the time memorial for us colonists and settlers.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to recognize too, there is, I study parenting, it's my thing. And in my experience in working with parents, there's about 20 to 30 other options I can come off the top of my head in an approach when we see, an alarming behavior that's surprising, or there's so many other options now. So it is absolutely appalling that this is still an archaic law in Canada. And just to remind everybody, in the Criminal Code of Canada, Section 43 does give parents the enables parents a legal sanction to use reasonable force as correction. And there is no reasonable, normal violence to use with children. So these laws are old and archaic, and just like Valerie Michelson would talk about, the normalized violence in our society. And it's up to us as Canadians and those that are in our legislature to stand up and end this. And so my question is to you, Jillian, what I'm really curious about, you touched a bit on it a moment ago, when the legislation went through. So here in Canada, what we hear is things like, well, all these parents are just going to go to jail, which is also an indicator that all these parents are hitting their kids. So we do need to help kids. But in that argument as well is the recognition. I come from a place of compassion for parents. I really believe in liberating parents through legislation and policy design. And, I do see opportunities for, this to really, really help kids. You mentioned that. So tell me more. What happens after with parents, legislation, and also can you touch on social workers? I think there's service provider conversation there as well.
Yeah, so when the legislation went through, and actually our Minister for Children commenced it very quickly within 2 months, which is unusual in Ireland, that law, it's commenced and it comes into full effect. I was afraid that they might delay it, but they didn't. So one was positive for us, was that our Prime Minister chose to speak on the legislation in the lower house, which is really unusual. For him to speak on a children's issue was unusual. But he came in specially to do it, which I was particularly felt proud about. But I thought it was leadership again, going back, to his appointment of ensuring there was a voice for children in the Seanad. It was him showing also, because this was an issue. He comes from the west of Ireland, very rural community. He much older man. So actually having him speak on the issue and showing his support, and that the world was going to still turn. Was important. What it did for our police, for social workers, when I interviewed and talked to them afterwards, they all used the term clarity. So when social workers said to me previously, Jillian, if I was working with a family, I would have to say, well, you can't really hit your child. It's not really a good idea, but it was a moral discussion. They said, rather than the law says you can't hit your child. So now let's talk about what you can do.
Nice.
So they said it actually changed. It gave clarity for them, but it also changed the dynamic of the relationship. So that it wasn't about them moralizing or making a judgment piece. Or what I often heard in Ireland, and I'm sure you've similar, is some people said to me, oh, but Jillian, you're changing the law because of new communities coming to Ireland. They're much more likely to hit their children. And I go, well, where's your evidence? Why are you saying this? It doesn't necessarily equate. But what does equate is that we're more likely to believe that families on lower incomes or lower social we're much more likely to report, more likely to believe that they therefore have these issues, when in fact researchers will be able to show you children can be abused in any different type of family form. So we actually need to change our biases and our thinking.
Absolutely.
So when we changed the law, I did try to look. I talked to our director of public prosecutions. I talked to our social workers. Nobody could give me any visible increase that they could see. Like they didn't see any change that there was all of a sudden. But what they did see was, one, they had clarity, and it put a greater onus then on our social work or services to actually give parenting supports. So they because they now needed to fill this gap, this perceived gap that was there. So it put the responsibility on those different arms of the state to actually talk to parents about what does work and how we can support you in your role of being a parent. I was very clear as we brought through this law, I wasn't seeking for parents to be prosecuted, or I just want children not to be hit, and it doesn't work. So like, for me, if you don't hit your child, it's not going to end up. So as I said at the beginning, I think all too often those opposing it have this idea that parents are on one side of the room and children are on the other side of the room. And my experience is very different. It's actually parents want to know what works, how they can do best for their child, what they can do. And by us leaving this in legislation, and that's why I will go, I will talk to any country about changing it, because the idea that we leave this in our legislation, we're making it more difficult for parents. We're making their role even tougher. And so for me is, yes, it's a children's rights issue, and I'm a children's rights activist, but we need parents, and we need to tell parents what works. And hitting your child does not work.
And having exactly, and so well said. What I'm hearing right here is just that so important, because I agree, after working with parents for so many years I do one-on-ones parenting interventions, and I'll be honest, I can't say enough about every parent I've worked with who just wants to do the best that they can and once they know what to do differently, it is why I do this work. So they are ready for information. They want to change. We've all heard the term parenting guilt, and it's normalized. Parents just don't know what to do. And when they're under stress, they do what's on their sleeve. And that is definitely something that we need to help them with, because it's awful. And what also is interesting is to think of how this law can put services in place and hold the federal government accountable for, to supporting families and keeping them together and reducing conflict. And also, I think it has bigger picture too, when families understand what is causing family stress. So this, a law like this has an opportunity to be a bottom line in changing our perspective and mindset on how we look at family relationships as the core of our societies and communities, and how we can support parents to do the best that they can do to take care of our children, which is obviously our future. Tell me, so there was no uptick in parents going to jail? There was no jailing children?
Not even a blip. There wasn't even a little bump in the chart or anything. So there's no one. I have worked since I made the change in Ireland with Scotland and Wales has just commenced their legislation recently, but they did this long lead-in time, and that was they did a really excellent process, as well as did Scotland. But they changed their laws in 2019 and 2020. And they equally, I'm not seeing any reports coming to say all of a sudden that there is this uptake. But I suppose it is this piece about, and you touched on it there, about guilt and parenting, and these scare tactics that I find really reprehensible. That, those of us who want to change the law, that in some way we want to see parents jailed. Right. No, I want to see families work. And we know hitting children does not work. So I want to support parents in that role. And that's why legislators need to make those changes in the law. We don't need a report in 100 years' time to tell us what we did was wrong. And all the evidence now shows us. So we now need to make sure that all of our laws are making that home a really safe place. And absolutely, I was particularly proud because I literally came from Wales in February 2020, and then we got hit by COVID. And I thought of, and throughout COVID, I've been thinking about that home being a safe place. And this period, we've put children back into family
Oh,
homes, which is great. But laws of countries like Canada has made it a really unsafe place for some children.
15 times more reports of child maltreatment. And as my experience, this number is not slowing down. So patterns of behavior now of
Yeah.
stress are set in. So this is really, children are a great risk. And thank you for mentioning that. Jillian, so tell me more about what happened from a legislator, policymaker, programming, what happened in Ireland after to support parents. So how did that change?
So our Child and Family Agency, so part of that changes during my period as a senator, one of the changes was our Child and Family Services used to be part of our general health services.
Okay.
So we had one big health body that dealt with hospitals, primary, secondary, tertiary care. So they did everything, and they still do everything for everything else. But the state extracted out the Child and Family Agency. It's called TUSLA now. So it's actually a very large agency. So that was established officially in 2014 prior to this law coming in. So we've seen that the state is now really strengthening its work of working with children and families. So we've a dedicated support services or social workers. So we're now trying to build more wraparound services. You talked there earlier, and I often think about it when I was a senator. One of the reports I read was about children who died in the care of the state, and it's very distressing to look and look why, and what happened. But when you saw how many arms of the state a parent needs to interact with to get the services for their child, I'm going, well, I'm, business and I can do all these things. I couldn't interact without that many arms of the state and navigate it, let alone. So the idea of the Child and Family Agency is that it's more wraparound, so that parents have one contact and that person is supposed to seek and find the services for the parent. So it's trying to re-engineer. Now we still have quite a journey to go on, but it is part of our atoning for our past, because Ireland had the institutions, children being forced into institutions.
Right.
We've had our different survivors. So this is part of our atonement, is how do we re-engineer these services so that when a family is in crisis, or when a family just needs support and help and not get into the crisis, where do they go to get that help? Where do they go to get that support? Yeah, so that we're trying to bring all those services together and wrap it around the parent so that they just need to say, I'm here, you need to come to me, and can you help me? And the services should be able to access the other services that they need. Instead of the parent having 10 appointments, they have one appointment that is able to help them.
We just did this here in British Columbia. The changes are coming into effect very soon. We're going to be opening up 51 parent hubs across the province. Hopefully it's similar to what you're talking about. Can you tell me more? Was there any specific, so there's a Ministry of Children and Families, kind of similar, I'm trying to put it all together and
so for the first time ever in 2011, we had a Minister for Children. It then became the Minister for Children and Youth. It's now actually the Minister for Children, Equality, Diversity, Integration and Youth. So he's got this.
That's great.
He's now got this big, long title. We have lots of long titles in Ireland, but children, I suppose for me, what was important is we're now on our third government since 2011, and children have kept their own ministry. And it's now become normalized. Yeah. And when I say this, in Ireland, we have a limit of 15 ministers. Our constitution limits it. So we can have junior ministers, we can have lower levels. This is a senior minister at the cabinet table, full decision-making powers. For children. And it's really, so we, as part of that policies, we did strategies, better outcomes, brighter future. So it's a 10-year strategy that encompasses all government departments to try and look at what we're doing for children. And this is, we, as I said to you earlier, we changed our constitution to strengthen children's rights in it. And I suppose it is all of that atonement piece and trying to make sure that the Ireland of today and the Ireland of the future is a great place to be a child. And when I was with the Children's Rights Alliance and we were doing our strategic planning, we were trying to, the theorists were saying, but what is the problem you're trying to solve? And the problem we were trying to solve, and I think we still are, is that in Ireland, we believe it's a great place to be a child, but the evidence suggests otherwise. And for us, we're trying to change that evidence piece, because actually we do want to be a great place to be a child. We want Ireland to be one of the best places in the world, one of the best places, not the best, just one of the best places in the world to be a child, because we should all be working to make this world better. And we see so much happening around the world, and it is really scary what's happening around the world. But if we invest in our children, in that future, I think for me, it's what we should all be doing. And that's where we should be working with parents, providing those supports. So I'm still involved in youth work because it's really important. Children have other adults in their lives who they can trust, who they can talk to, who they can support, who they can navigate. Look, if your body was going through, like when I'm talking to parents about their teenage, I work with girls, teenage daughters, like I'm going, yeah, but just think, if your body was going through so much changes, of course you'd be moody. Of course you'd be trying to work out where you want to go. So they need somebody else. And parents, like, they laugh. Like, one of them will laugh at me because her daughter, when we go camping, will get up really early in the morning to talk to me. And she goes, I can't get my daughter out of the bed in the morning. And she gets up at 6 o'clock to talk to you. But this is where we need to allow children to have their childhoods and have that fun. And childhood is so fleeting. Like, any of us are thinking, wow, my childhood is lifetimes ago. So it is so fleeting. We need to protect them. We need to just do all we can to allow them to be children. And, I think you mentioned earlier about coming out of the pandemic. I'm certainly seeing it in Ireland. There is delayed development capacity in some of our children. And that's going to add to stress of parents, because one child is going to be more ahead than another child at that age. And we're going to have all of these unsettling pieces. And I think we all just need to just take a breath and calmly navigate that the path is going to be different for each of us as we move. But we need to make sure the support is there. So we need to make sure that we can all take those different pathways, and we'll find our way out of this dark period that we're going through with the Ukraine conflict, with the pandemic. But actually, we have so much, Canada and Ireland, we have so much richness. So let's not lose sight of that. And let's do all we can to make our countries really great for children, and allow us to, to have them to have those happy childhoods. But let that childhood be free from violence. Like, the idea that our laws make home an unsafe place. Like, I just, when just try and unpack it and think about it. I know you're convinced, but when you think about it, I ended my recent talk in Canada saying 100 years ago, you could hit your wife, your dog, and your child. And yet, we changed our laws on domestic violence, animal cruelty. People have we change our laws. And then we get to children and we start debating when and why it's okay. And your Canada law, for me, looking from an outside, wow, it's absurd that you've put criteria of when you can hit children.
Yeah.
It's just abhorrent. So we really need to just rethink about this. Why are we saying, like, I get home at the end of the day, okay, we've all spent far too much time at home recently, but normally when you get home, you can relax. Can you imagine being in the position that this is the place where the law of your land allows you to be hit? This is the place. This is the unsafest place for you. Like, it's just wrong. So I would hope, and I'm certainly, I'm hoping to travel to Canada later in the year. I'm hoping to encourage your legislators, but I'm hoping everybody is not to say, well, let's do A, B, and C first. Let's do the research. Let's get more parent support. You just change the law. Get over it. The research is there. What else do you need to know? Change the law.
I was just going to ask you advice for Canada, and I'm hearing just change the law. Like, we don't have to have these conversations. It's so clear. The evidence is, it's insurmountable. It's ineffective. It is archaic. There's tons of better options. This will support families. It also helps grandparents feel more safe. I've got a list here: clarity for social workers. It is also dedicated supports for parents. It also provides a ton of opportunity with other legislation to make sure that homes are safe. This is a no-brainer. Let's just change the law. Jillian, how do we change this law in Canada? What do we do? How do we do this?
I would certainly encourage anybody watching or listening here is to find their legislator that they feel could champion this. I think somebody has to go in onto your house and champion it, bring forward either a private member's bill or put an amendment to legislation. And they need to step up for children now and say, this is, the time is now. I'm very happy to share all of my learnings with whomever wishes to do that. But start bringing it forward. I've said about smoking bans and seat belts in cars. Like, we now look back at those type of issues going, why were we debating them? And if you think of all this time that we're debating this, when we could be spending time talking to parents about what works and have that clarity. So, yeah, I would certainly encourage people to just, and your legislators in particular, to step up and change that law. And whether you do it, at a federal level or at a state, you need to just really look at the provinces or say, how are we going to do this? Because, in the UK, everybody said to Scotland and Wales, you can't do it. It has to be the UK that does it first. And Scotland and Wales went, well, we don't like our children being hit, we're going to change the law. So Scotland and Wales has now changed it. Jersey has done it also.
If Britain did it before us, considering the colonization, I think Canada should get on it. All of these colonized countries, and Britain's going to beat us to it. So I think it's kind of saying something.
Yeah. No, and I think for all for your values in Canada and all that you stand, it is out of kilter. This law is an anomaly.
Yes. So that's so true, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point. Part of the challenge for us that are kind of working to raise public awareness about this is because Canadians actually think it's bad to hit kids. They think it's illegal. So what that does though is it closets those that are. It becomes more of a taboo. So it's more quiet. People think it's not happening. It really is happening. And but because Canadians think a lot of Canadians think it's illegal, and so there's Canadians were like other countries that are, developed, very privileged, super apathetic on these kind of issues, and really hard to get them upstanding. And so, it's a really baffling, archaic law that's still on the books, that still gives sanctions to abuse. There is no excuse for child abuse, and it's happening. And so what I'm hearing from you, Jillian, is we just need to change the law. And I like that kind of, you said earlier, it can happen pretty quietly. I don't think there's going to be, a huge uproar of people that are going to be, no, we need to hit kids, right? I actually think the Canadians are going to get a big sigh of relief. Yeah. This is in line with who we are and our values in Canada. So
and we didn't have a big fanfare in Ireland or a big, it wasn't but what was interesting was that before we changed the law, people urged me, many people, civil servants, politicians urged me, as I said, not to do it, wait. Yeah. The moment we did it, the very same people looked at me and they claimed success. Like they said, why didn't we do this years ago? Why didn't we? And like it was light switch, that light bulb came on, and they saw that the world was still turning and that everything was okay when we changed the law. And so they felt part of the success. And you know what? I didn't mind, because actually this is the law of the land. It's for me, we have a shared responsibility. But it did remind me again about how that behavioral changed, like that when our laws change, it is just people go, well, that's the law. That's what we do.
Isn't that meaningful on why we need to change the law? Right? Because it's such a foundation of how we behave, right? It does keep us safe. It is, the law is there kind of as we think to protect us. And right now, this is injustice for children. Yeah. And so when people think of the difference between justice and law, this is the law I think about. This is not just, it is not okay that children can be exposed to violent discipline in their homes. There is no reasonable force. I said over and over again, there is options for parents out there. And even though there is this law in the books, please do get in touch with people if you are at risk or you feel like that you are going to use violence at home. There's help out there. It's hard to find, but I encourage all parents to do that. And, Jillian, I can't thank you enough for being here. And I also do want to thank you for speaking at the ISPCAN, I can never say those words, symposium recently on supporting Ashley and Valerie
Brilliant team.
and
Joan, yeah.
for the rationale for repeal of Section 43, for your voice in Canada and all over the world, really, in just making sure that children, have protection from violence, and also for making sure that parents have support. This has been an incredible conversation, and I just want to ask if there's anything that you could add to give Canada support for this legislation change.
No, I would say no fanfare, just do it. Just change the law.
Right,
the time is
Jillian van Turnhout, this is all we can do. We just need to change the law. Thank you so much, Jillian, and everybody out there for watching. Please do like, comment, and share our Facebook posts, our YouTubes, and we are coming out with a new website. There'll be buttons all over it to contact your MP, to write letters to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. It is time to push the button. There is no more research that's needed. Corporal punishment is ineffective and it harms kids and it adds stress to families. Parents need support now. So let's work together and make some noise and change this law. And also just send out cheers as we do that to heroes like Jillian van Turnhout out in Ireland. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And thank you, everybody, for watching.